To start off the show, we will be discussing Hempfield's income.
State funding is a significant portion of the district's budget.
We spoke to State Representative Ryan Almond to learn how money gets from the state to your local school district.
The first step is the whole process is the governor comes out with his budget proposal. That usually happens in February or March, typically in February of the year. So he'll have the opportunity to come out and present a budget to the General Assembly. And that will be his general appropriation for 2015-2016. Included in that will be a overall funding for K through 12 education. This past year, the budget that we adopted was a total about 10.6, nearly $10.7 billion that was appropriated for K through 12 public education. That funding is then distributed to your local school districts. We have 500 across the Commonwealth by formula. And of course, that state funding, then there's federal funding that our school districts receive that's appropriated from Washington, D.C. And then of course, there's also local tax dollars through the local property tax that's brought into the school district. And all of that together provides funding for our schools across the state.
Marilyn Niley, Hempfield's Director of Finance, discussed how state funding affects the district.
State funding is usually somewhere around a quarter of our overall budget, 25–26%, in that kind of range. Sometimes there's a direct tie. For example, there's a subsidy for employer FICA taxes for Social Security, Medicare costs, and for the PESER's retirement. And that subsidy is calculated based on 50% of the district's actual costs. So there's a direct tie there. We know what that subsidy is going to be based on our actual spending. Other things are not entirely as clear, and I'll use special education as an example of that. It's a direct line item of funding from the state, but there is no direct calculation of what are our expenses versus how much money do we get from the state. One of the biggest concerns that I typically talk about is the uncertainty each year of what the state funding is going to be.
We'll start talking to the board, do presentations in February, March, and April. And in May, the school board has to approve our final budget for the next year. Meanwhile, the state hasn't decided what it's doing.
So we adopt our local budget with the best guess that we have, the best estimate that we have on what that state funding is probably going to look like.
One cause of the recent discrepancies in Hempfield's budget is the collapse of the PlanCon system.
PlanCon was a system established by the state to help schools invest in buildings and infrastructure.
School districts have various stages, various steps they must follow to receive their reimbursement.
2 years ago, the state was underfunded in the PlanCon area, and so at that point they stopped it. They said, we're not going to start any new projects, we're not going to provide funding on anything until they go back and figure out how to redo it. We're still stuck in that time frame right now. They did, here a few months ago, start to say things that were in the pipeline. So for us, Landisville Intermediate Center, East Petersburg Elementary School, and Farmdale were all built, started through the process, had all the approvals, but no reimbursements were being made on any of those buildings. So we were caught in that, okay, you can go ahead, but we don't know what you're going to do funding-wise. So over the last 2 years, there's a couple $100,000, probably about $450,000 in total that we should have received from the state that we haven't. And a long term, obviously when you talk about 3 buildings and about $45 million in construction, and 10% of that is $4.5 million. So we're looking at $6 million over the next 20 years that should be coming back from the state. And how is that going to come? And if it doesn't come, then what are we going to have to cut or adjust to make that?
State funding is an important part of Hempfield's budget, but the majority of the district's income is generated by taxes. Taylor Harnish and Duncan Brady reported on this source of revenue.